Hello, this is Mr. Chabry, and I'm going to be showing you our Paris trip. After nearly 7 hours on the flight, and getting our stuff settled in our hotel, the first thing we decided to do was check out the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc is massive in size and is dedicated to the rise of Imperial France in the early 19th century. The next location was also a massive monument, and that was the Eiffel Tower. These videos do little to convey the enormous scale of this tower. And it's something you'll simply have to see in person to understand how large this structure is. Here are some different angles I got of the Eiffel Tower. After standing in line, we were able to view Paris from the Eiffel Tower, and let me tell you, this structure is really tall. From this side, we can see the Seine River and really tall towers off in the distance. That's actually outside of Paris proper. There's certain building height limits in the actual city. So when you see the actual tall buildings off in the distance, that's actually sort of like the suburbs of Paris. Here I decided to point the camera up at the top. We're actually at the second level of the Eiffel Tower. Here I just follow the river trying to see other parts of the city. So once we come down, we get a bite to eat, and we actually sat near this structure. This is the chimney of the Eiffel Tower. We then make our way to the Isle de Cité, the little island that exists in the center of Paris. This building here is the Conciergerie. This is actually the structure that Marie Antoinette was kept prisoner during the French Revolution. This clock right here is actually a part of that building, and it's a really old clock. And on the Isle de Cité is Notre Dame. This is one of the most famous structures in Paris, and this thing is stunning. It is quite large. Of course, we weren't able to go inside because they're still doing repair work, but here we can actually see the statues of the different kings on the front of the Notre Dame. And you can see the bell towers up there where Quasimodo would have made his living quarters. Of course, you can't see the flying buttresses because they've got scaffolding for the repair work, and they've got it all fenced off. They've got that big, large barrier in the front. But over in this angle, you can see the statue of Charlemagne. Charlemagne, if you don't know, is the emperor of the Frankish Empire during the 800s. His empire stretched from Germany to France and portions of northern Italy. This guy conquered a lot of the European world of his time. And here his statue sits next to Notre Dame. Here we get a different angle, and we can actually get closer on this side of the cathedral. And we get a better view of the gargoyles, which are very famous for Notre Dame. After eating a quick breakfast at Starbucks, we make our way to the Louvre. If there's one thing I can say about Paris, it is a very grand city. This museum is enormous. Of course, you can see the iconic glass pyramid, but this huge structure actually wraps all the way around this little garden area. There are also statues on the face of this building. Here I decided to record some of them. Here's a better look at those glass pyramids. The line to enter was actually really long. Once we're finally inside, we start off with the French sculptures. And here we have a statue of Napoleon. We then find ourselves in the Babylonian section. We then work our way towards the Renaissance section. We then find ourselves face to face with King Louis XIV, the Sun King. And this room here is a breathtaking room with the painting on the ceiling. In an adjacent room, we find a portrait of King Louis XV, the great-grandson of King Louis XIV. We find ourselves in the section containing ancient Greek sculptures. It is here where we find one of the most famous Greek sculptures, the Venus de Milo. We also find the bust of the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt. We also find the statue of Nike. And here is a model of the Temple of Zeus. The amazing thing about the Louvre is not only are there great works of art on the walls, but the ceilings themselves house great works of art. We then find ourselves in the Italian Renaissance paintings. I call this one Spider-Man Jesus. When it comes to the Italian Renaissance, you must come into the green room. As you can see, it's very well packed. And that is because this room houses the Mona Lisa, one of the most famous pieces of art in history. The crazy thing is, this line is just to see the Mona Lisa. No other art piece in this museum has a line dedicated just for it. We now reach what I call the Red Rooms. These rooms house artwork from French artists dating to the 18th and 19th century. The room that I'm currently standing in also houses their gift shop. That was pretty interesting. Here we see one of the Red Rooms with plenty of notable artwork. This famous piece here is Liberty Leading Her People, dedicated to the 1830 Revolution. Here we find Joan of Arc, and through this doorway, there's actually a cafeteria area built into the Louvre, which is actually really nice for guests and tourists who want to stop to grab a bite to eat. We end up refueling with some drinks and some eclairs. And it's back to the Red Room. We're actually on a hunt for one of Jesse's favorite artists, that is Elizabeth Vigée-Braun, and she actually has an art piece in one of these rooms. We find artwork of Napoleon coronating Josephine as his empress. I do believe that there's another copy of this in Versailles that we will see soon. We actually find the art piece, and Jessie is so excited because we found one of her favorite artists. Here is the Oath of the Horatii, painted by Jacques-Louis David. The Red Rooms contain amazing artwork that any tourist would need to come and see. While walking to the next section, we found this beautiful courtyard. We eventually find our way to the ancient Roman sculptures. We then come across the ancient Egyptian section. After this, we decided to go ahead and go to the cafeteria to get a bite to eat. Of course, we didn't see everything in the Louvre. The Louvre has so many artworks, so many historical artifacts that it would take more than a day to make sure you see everything. Today we ate burgers and fries. As we exited, we checked out the inverted glass pyramid. And we saw some sculptures that they have as you exit the museum. Here are some more shots of the little garden area directly in front of the Louvre. They also had a Ferris wheel in front of the Louvre. Here's that arch in front of the Louvre. But what I want to point out is the Eiffel Tower in the distance. You literally can see that anywhere in the city. Jessie is so excited as we make our way to the next area. And that next area is the Tuileries. This was once a royal garden, but now it's pretty much a garden for the community. Parisians make their way here for the shade. And to wrap up our second day, we stop at the Concorde. So this is actually where Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI both met therein at the edge of a guillotine. On day 3, we make our way to the Art Bridge. This is actually the famous bridge where people put locks on. However, they don't do that anymore on this bridge, and we'll actually find the bridge that they pretty much moved that practice to in a little bit. But here's some shots I got from the bridge. And this is our goal for today. This is the d'Orsay Museum. The d'Orsay houses newer artworks than the Louvre. The artworks from here are from the 19th and the 20th century. Here are some photographs. Photographs are really great at capturing a specific moment in time. Here's some artwork I found on the bottom floor. Jessie found herself drawn to the Impressionist artist. She's always loved Impressionist art. And it's down here where Jessie finds another favorite artist. This is an art piece from Van Gogh. Of course, we're going to see more Van Gogh as we continue through the d'Orsay. Here we have a miniature model of the Opera House. This is the same Opera House that the Phantom of the Opera takes place in. Here's a miniature of Paris, followed by a painting of Paris in the 1850s. Here is one of the clocks of the d'Orsay. We can see across the river to the Louvre on the other side. I have a lot of footage of the Impressionist section. Here we have Luncheon in the Grass, a very famous piece. As you can see, there are a ton of Impressionist artwork here. Here we have some Manet, some Degas, some Morisot, some Monet. Jessie was so excited to be in this section of the museum. In this set of paintings, Monet is actually testing out different lighting conditions on the same chapel. Here are some water lilies from Monet. Of course, we're going to see quite a few more water lilies from Monet in the upcoming days. Here we find some Renoir. Here we find another view of the river. We then found a room dedicated to just Van Gogh. While it's not the Starry Night, we do find a painting called Starry Night over the Rhone. Here we find one of the paintings that is at the top of Jessie's list of paintings that she wanted to see, and that is the self-portrait of Van Gogh. The d'Orsay houses plenty of Van Gogh artwork, and Van Gogh is another one of Jessie's favorite artists, so of course she was over the moon in this section. Just like the Louvre, there was a cafe built within the d'Orsay, and we decided to stop and eat lunch. I went with the quiche as Jessie went with some pasta. We then found some sculptures to look at. Here we have some paintings in rooms that are connected to the walkway where all the sculptures are attached. I always found this painting striking as the people struggle to make it through the desert. When the Orsay was built, it was originally a train station. Eventually we find some sculptures from Rodin. This right here is the gateway to hell. You might notice a familiar figure sitting up here. This is the Thinker. This is actually where he originated the idea of the Thinker. He later made larger copies of the Thinker, since it became so famous. We found some interior design elements within the museum as well. I thought it'd be interesting to compare the lion from this museum to the lion from the Louvre. This time Jesse was on a mission to find Pierre Bonnard's The White Cat. We saw signs that we were getting close to the painting in question. Here's a piece by Henri Rousseau. Another sign. And I want to point out the paintings with cats seem to be popular with people wanting to get pictures. And finally, we found it. Not only did we find it, but we found another cat painting to the left of it. We finally found a room dedicated to Manet. We also find a painting that contains a small cat. This is another famous painting, and I'm glad we made our way into this room. Here's a painting of a group of people enjoying a nice barbecue. At the end of the Orsay trip, we were wore out. I feel like we've gotten more time in the Orsay than we did in the Louvre. As we left the Orsay, we crossed the bridge with the locks. And as we looked back one last time, Jessie had an idea of something else that she would love to do. We then booked tickets for a boat ride. From here we have another view of the Eiffel Tower. This bridge with golden statues is a stunning work of architecture. Here we got another view of the d'Orsay. Every bridge on this river had its own history, its own design, and its own personality. Here we pass through an area where people often dance later in the evening. Here we have Notre Dame from the river. We are now passing by what is known as St. Louis Island. This is a smaller island which is really near the Isle de Cité. We can see a different angle on Notre Dame from here. All that you can see from this angle is just the bell towers. Here's where we pass by the Conciergerie. It looks so amazing, especially from the river. We passed by the d'Orsay once again. It's crazy to think that a few hours ago we were inside this structure. It's easy to say that the Eiffel Tower dominates the skyline of Paris. We see a T-Rex on another boat. Don't worry though, if we don't move, it can't see us. Here I've zoomed in so you can see the tourist on the Eiffel Tower. And after the boat ride, Jessie and I eat some ham and cheese crepes. Can't forget the milkshakes. On day 4, we made our way to the Palace of Versailles. This palace is another massive structure. Here we have the statue of King Louis XIV, the king that made this into his living quarters. And you can see the gold that is on top of the roof of the structure. Here's a golden gate that the commoners would see their king through. The first thing we decided to do while we were here was check out the royal gardens, and these gardens are enormous. It's quite disorienting when you see how huge this whole entire landscape is. This little section here is known as the L'Orangerie. It is where they would have orange trees. Here's a behind shot of the palace. The gardens house beautiful sculptures, beautiful fountains, and beautiful hedges. All the trees create a labyrinth. This area is known as the ballroom. We find the Bacchus Fountain. Near that is the Queen's Grove. While most of the fountains were turned off in the gardens, the mirror fountain was actually set up to go with some Baroque music from the era. We sat here for a good 4 minutes to watch the beautiful display of waterworks that this fountain delivered. Directly behind the mirror fountain was the King's Grove. This area used to contain its own fountain with a bunch of water. However, King Louis XVIII decided he would rather have a garden space. Here we have a view of the chateau from Saturn's fountain. The Colonnade Grove was breathtaking. This is a well-designed structure with a sculpture in the center and colonnades surrounding it. The sculpture represents Hades kidnapping Persephone, and the faces that adorn the colonnade all the way around represent the faces witnessing Hades' sin. They also contain these fountains that were unfortunately turned off when we were there, but it would have been beautiful to see these running. We then found ourselves face to face with the Apollo Fountain. This fountain was King Louis XIV's favorite fountain since he self-identified with Apollo, the sun god. These fountains were also turned off, but these would have been amazing to see running. This depicts the scene where Apollo has defeated Python, the great serpent. Directly behind this fountain is the Grand Channel. Of course, you can see a lot of people renting out boats to enjoy this area. Here's a view of the chateau from this fountain. As you can see, it is quite far into the distance. That's what I mean when I say this area is disorienting. And here we have a view from the chateau to the Grand Channel. We soon found, in my opinion, one of the coolest fountains here, and that is the Enceladus Fountain. It is surrounded by this beautiful lattice structure that helps the plants grow. The fountain itself is supposed to represent Enceladus letting out a final scream as he gets buried alive by rocks. However, the fountain was turned off, so we didn't get to see the cool effect that brings. Here we have the Flora Fountain. Notice how 2 ravens had made this their perch. We notice that there are some fish swimming within the Dauphin's Fountain. It is in the Dauphin's Grove that we actually find a burger shack and decide to go ahead and grab some burgers and fries. We decide to go ahead and start making our way back towards the front in order to actually go into the palace. And on our way we find this grove. This is known as the Apollo Bath Grove. The gardens are breathtakingly beautiful, and I'm so glad we were able to experience this area. Of course, we didn't get to see it all because it is so enormous, and our tickets had a specific time that we had to be up front. After standing in line for a short duration, we were able to go inside, and the inside of this building is magnificent, just as the outside is. This first area is actually the chapel, and we'll actually return here, but from upstairs. This room contains a family tree showing the Bourbons. These early rooms contain much of the history of Versailles, starting out when King Louis XIII created this as his hunting lodge, all the way up to King Louis XVIII commemorating this structure for the French people. In this early set of rooms, there are plenty of paintings, models, and artifacts from early on in Versailles history that makes you feel like you're connected with the history of this wonderfully grand palace. Right here is a model of not only the palace but the gardens, and it's really interesting that we had just seen this right before we came in here. King Louis XIV was a huge figure from his time, and these next set of rooms are actually dedicated to his life and his reign over France. And each of these rooms have paintings to represent different historical scenes, such as, in here we see a bunch of battle scenes. This room contains some artwork that he had commissioned early on in his reign. Louis XIV saw art as a very important thing for his reign. So this room is dedicated to the organization of the Royal Academy. King Louis was a larger-than-life figure. This room is actually dedicated to his cabinet officials. This room is dedicated to some important meetings that took place in Versailles with other European leaders. And we get a sense that this guy really saw himself as the center of the universe. We find another room. This one's actually dedicated to the females that made their home here in Versailles under King Louis's wing. Louis saw himself as a warrior king, so of course he dedicated plenty of artwork to the wars that he fought. Versailles, with all its splendor, all its amazing qualities, it really does exist as a perfect home for someone that saw themselves as such a big figure of not only Europe, but the entire world. We now find our way in the top part of the chapel that we saw earlier. This is a stunning view. Even the doors contain gold here. And the ceilings are decorated with beautiful art. And in the upcoming rooms, every single ceiling is painted beautifully. This room is known as the Hercules room, and it is the room where balls would take place. The Room of Abundance is where people would eat. The Venus room was a reception area for people coming to visit the king. This room was meant to be breathtaking for those coming to visit Versailles for stately reasons. The Diana room was used as a lobby for those visiting Versailles. You get a sense that King Louis XIV really compared himself to the ancient Romans, as you can see with some of these sculptures of ancient Romans, and how each of these rooms are named after a Roman deity. Here we see the fleur-de-lis, which is the royal crest for the Bourbons, and the ceiling, which is breathtaking as well. The Mars room was used by King Louis's guards. Even though it contains a bed, the Mercury room was actually just for ceremony. The king did not actually sleep in this room. Arguably one of the most important rooms in this section of Versailles is the Apollo room. This is actually where King Louis's throne would sit. He fashioned himself after Apollo, the Sun King, and he saw that the world seems to have revolved around him, just like it does the sun. The next room is the War Room. This room is dedicated to the military victories that King Louis XIV had. As you can see, he pretty much compares himself to an ancient Roman. Instead of putting what would have been contemporary military gear on the paintings, he actually uses ancient Roman gear on what are meant to be his soldiers. Arguably one of the most famous rooms of Versailles is the Hall of Mirrors, and this room is also breathtaking. It is a long corridor with windows on one side and mirrors on the other to reflect the light and to really brighten this room up. You have to remember, back in the day, they did not have electrical lighting, so people coming to visit Versailles would probably have been blown away by this room. The next room was the council room, and this is the room where important government decisions were made. Finally, we make it to the king's bedroom. This is actually the bed that the king would have slept in during his reign. And you can see his room is decked out in a lot of gold. The next room is the bullseye room, and this is where his courtesans would wait for him to wake up every morning. At the opposite end of the Hall of Mirrors, we come to the Peace Room. This is representing the peacetime prosperity that King Louis brought. And we finally reach the Queen's Room. As you can see, this room contains a bust of Marie Antoinette. This is the room that she would have slept in during her time as queen here. And you could tell this is decked out in a lot of gold as well. The Nobles' Room was also used by the Queen. This was for more informal gatherings. Now this is the room where the king and queen would eat their meals. And of course when they did this, the public was actually invited, not to eat, but to watch them eat. This room with the painting of Jupiter on his throne on the ceiling is actually the Queen's Guard's room. As you may remember, we saw a painting of this in the Louvre, and here it is in the Versailles as well. The next room is the 1792 room. It's actually dedicated to the French Revolution. On either side you can see big war scenes painted on the walls. A statue of Louis Philippe, their final king, also sits here next to the 1792 room. The next area is known as the Hall of Battles, and this hall contains paintings of major battles in French history, starting off with the wars that Clovis fought right after the fall of Rome, all the way up to what would have been a pretty recent war to when this room was opened, and that would be the Napoleonic Wars. And as we exit the building, we see a hall of French historical figures. It is at this time we made our way to the Trianon, trying to get to the Queen's Hamlet before the park closes. The Trianon exists as a separate garden outside of the official garden of Versailles, and there's many things to see there as well. The thing that we were on a mission to find was the Queen's Hamlet, and here it is. This little village area is where Marie Antoinette would spend most of her time away from official business of the Versailles Palace. And as you can see, she has little houses here. She has a pond here, bridges built here, a water mill built here. She had pretty much a lot of stuff that was really a getaway from home. She would even grow a garden here and have some vegetables if she decided she wanted to eat something while she was out here. And in keeping with that, we actually found some tomatoes growing on the vine out here in the Queen's Garden. So this was an amazing experience to see all of these old buildings, seeing the bridge across the little creek that was built just for Marie Antoinette. All in all, the Palace of Versailles, the gardens, and the Queen's Hamlet were an eye-opening, jaw-dropping experience. Beautiful and a wonderful... I just can't explain how wonderful this place was, this experience was. And a lot of this is stuff that you'd have to see in person to actually understand how amazing it is. On day 5, we return to the Isle de City. That way we can see the cathedral known as Sainte Chapelle. This is a stunning piece of architecture from the 1200s. And you can see the beautifully painted columns, the stained glass windows, even the ceiling has a lot of care and thought put into it. Here's a statue of King Louis IX, also known as Saint Louis. He was the king that commissioned to have this chapel built. Of course, the ground floor is stunning in its own right. Beautiful columns, beautiful stained glass windows down here. But the main attraction of this chapel is upstairs. This room is filled with larger-than-life stained glass windows that feels like it teleports you to a different time and place. The floors are covered in this beautiful tile work. Around the room, you see biblical scenes depicted in larger-than-life grandeur. Statues stand around the structure, staring at you as you walk through the room. Here we see a depiction of Jesus surrounded by a host of angels. This medallion could use some touch-up work. The vaulted ceiling is also beautiful. As you can see, this structure really does transport you to a different time and place. This area up front would have housed the relics that were brought here to this chapel. Though it consists of only 2 rooms, Sainte Chapelle is a stunning piece of architecture. Being that it dates from the Gothic era of cathedrals, of course the outside has gargoyles just like Notre Dame does. From this angle we can have a look at the beautiful spire that sits at the top of Sainte Chapelle. We then walk towards the other side of the Isle de City. Here we go past the Conciergerie once again. Once we reached the end of Isle de City, we found the memorial for the French who were killed during the Holocaust. These crystals represent the 200,000 from France that were killed during the Holocaust. A light is lit at the center of the corridor, and at either end are empty cells meant to represent the cells that these people would have been trapped in during the war. Outside is a gate with these sharp points representing the feeling of no escape that these people had during the war. This memorial is a solemn place for reflection, and it exists directly behind Notre Dame, so here we have a behind scene of Notre Dame. We then decide to go ahead, find a place to eat, and we learn that there's actually a cat cafe that exists. So now we're on a mission to find that cat cafe. We find a poster for the Thor, Love and Thunder, but that's not all we find. We also find where the Bastille once stood. This famous fortress was where the king kept his weaponry. During the French Revolution, the revolutionaries stormed the Bastille and burnt it down. And we find it. This place is a place where you can pet on some cats while you eat your dinner and hang out with some friends. This place had a lot of cat-themed decorations, from posters and photos. One of the cats starts sniffing around in my bag, trying to figure out what I have hidden. Another cat tries to join us from the top of the table. Eventually all the cats decide to go over to their little chairs and take a cat nap. It's at this time that we're finally able to order our food. I order a croque monsieur with a salad, as Jesse orders a burger with a salad. I'd have to say, so far, the Cat Cafe had been our best dining experience, just because these cats are adorable, and it was so much fun just seeing them laying around and interacting. That night, we decided to go to the Champs-Élysées to see it lit up. Seeing the Arc de Triomphe at night was a different experience than seeing it during the day. At night, you could clearly see the flame that was lit for the unknown soldier of World War I. This is here as a memorial for those that had lost their life during the Great War. People stood at the top of the arc to get a better view of what was to come. What everyone was waiting for would be from our south. That's where the Eiffel Tower dominated the skyline. As the sky grew darker and darker, everybody waited on bated breath. The Eiffel Tower began to shine a beam around in circles as if it was a lighthouse. After waiting patiently, we all saw it. The Eiffel Tower began to sparkle, and this is what everyone was here waiting for. The Eiffel Tower does this sparkle every night after sunset. It is an amazing thing to see in the sky. This is a beautiful end to a beautiful day. Day 6 starts off with an interesting subway ride. We find someone dancing to the music of Michael Jackson. On the subways, a lot of people like to perform for the passerbys. We saw people singing, people playing guitar, and for today we found someone dancing. But it's always interesting to see this as you pass through. Our next destination is actually here at the Tuileries. It's somewhere that we passed by before, but we weren't able to go in because we had not purchased the tickets. Now, with tickets in hand, we make our way to the L'Orangerie. Jessie, being so inspired by Impressionist artists, found herself drawn to this place. And of course, the main attraction of the L'Orangerie is Monet's Water Lily Room. These rooms give the viewer a unique experience. They consist of 8 large canvases that are warped so they fit the oval walls. They give the viewer a sense of reflection, being surrounded by the water and the flowers so that the viewer can collect their thoughts. And of course, this art installation was created after World War I. This was intended to be a space where people can come together and heal from collective trauma that was the Great War. The room has a tranquil and calming quality to it. Monet says these pieces are best viewed with a quiet reflection. So, I'm going to limit how many times I interject while we look at the remainder of the water lilies. Something I find intriguing about these pieces are that there's no horizon in the artwork. The pieces just swallow you in, creating an enveloping feeling of calmness. Another thing that I find intriguing is something that Monet does a lot in his artwork, and that's representing different times of day in his piece. Of course, the water lilies goes through different hours of the day. What I really like is this one here showing the sun rising, meaning a new dawn for the world after World War I. After spending a few minutes in the water lily room, we make our way to the other exhibits within the museum. We find a whole section dedicated to Renoir. He apparently painted multiple of these two girls at the piano. We saw some Renoir back in the d'Orsay, but his body of work is so vast that there's a lot of art here from him as well. We also find avant-garde Marie Laurencin. I find her style intriguing and unique. We then find a section of Matisse. We also find some more Henri Rousseau. Here are some Maurice Utrillo. Here are some Chaim Soutine. This is another unique artist. His art looks like it's melting. They also had a video presentation showing a little bit about Monet's life and his fascination with water lilies. We came across a few Picassos in the L'Orangerie. You can see him slowly transitioning into his iconic Cubism style. This space also holds some Modigliani art. I find this space interesting. You might think that this is a room that we're able to look in. However, this is all actually miniatures. And as I back up, you can see how small this little space actually is. But even with it this small, I find it fascinating that they created a convincing room out of these small miniature pieces. Even though we've already seen quite a few Impressionist artists at the d'Orsay, and we've already seen a lot of them here at L'Orangerie, there's actually a whole section dedicated just to Impressionist art. The thing I love most about Impressionist art is the almost dreamy quality it is. Art before this had more of a realistic overtone. However, with the invention of the camera, realism wasn't necessarily as important as it was before. However, the Impressionists saw art as a way of capturing emotion and the ephemeral nature of light. Of course, every Impressionist artist has their own style, but Monet's work almost seems sort of like that new DALL-E Mini app that's taking off. If you asked it to make an Impressionist piece, it would probably make something that looked a lot like Monet's work. There's something about Impressionist dreamy quality that makes it just so calming. I find these painted plates so intriguing. Jesse was really drawn to this piece. This is where Monet painted on a door. Out of all the artists that are featured here, the L'Orangerie obviously has more Monet than anything else. And of course, Monet is a wonderful Impressionist artist. He does a lot of natural settings. Later on in life, he actually started losing some of his color vision, making painting mind-blowing art like he once did harder and harder to do. And the water lilies that we saw earlier were actually some of his last pieces. So the fact that he was able not only to continue painting, but to continue painting amazing pieces of art is inspiring. We then stop at the cafe that's located within the L'Orangerie. I decide to go with an eggplant sandwich as Jesse gets a pizza and a lemon ice cream. I allow Jesse to select our last destination, and seeing the Picasso art at the L'Orangerie inspired her to go to the Picasso Museum. You don't need me to say that Picasso was a very unique artist. His Cubism style inspired a lot of people to try out new things. Of course, Cubism wasn't the only thing he did, and he tried different styles to find the specific style he liked. Here we see him taking the luncheon in the grass and doing his own style with that same theme. Here we can see different sketches that he tried out before he painted his versions of Luncheon in the Grass. We can see him trying different shapes and colors to get a different feel. Cubism took inspiration from African art. Around the time that Cubism began, that is around the same time Africa was being explored by Europeans. So of course, when pieces of art came in from the African continent, people in Europe were intrigued and they wanted to represent this within their own style of art. The thing that is really intriguing about the Picasso Museum that separates it from the other museums that we have saw is that this museum is within the same building that Picasso once called his home. So all of these rooms that we walk through were originally Picasso's house. And the fascinating thing is, even though the paintings have a more modern quality to them, the actual house has a classical style. Picasso was often inspired to do artwork depicting his children, and even do artwork for his children. He would eventually have 4 children of his own. Apparently this museum was actually kickstarted by his daughter named Maya. Here are some depictions that he did of his daughter Maya. The museum not only explains Picasso's life, but also Maya's life as well. Here's actually some photos of Maya's mother, and actually a video that Picasso recorded of her as well. Picasso met Maya's mother while he was actually married to his first wife. He then began an affair with her. You can see that she was a common subject of his art. This piece is actually meant to represent his emotions on finding out that Maya's mother was pregnant. He was happy to have another child, but he was sad that his marriage would not be able to survive this news. And the marriage did not survive. The two separated. However, they were unable to get a divorce because around that time, the Spanish Civil War began. And one of the things that happened was divorce was banned. You can see that Maya became a very common subject that Picasso would turn to in order to make art. Here we can see different sketches, different paintings that were meant to represent her. These pieces were actually paintings Picasso made specifically for Maya within her book. Here are some cutouts he did where he could do some cutout theater. Picasso not only did paintings, but he also did sculptures. Here are some sculptures from Picasso. Picasso used goats and minotaurs that were meant to represent him a lot in his works of art. Picasso's Cubism is one of those styles that are immediately recognizable. Once you see an artwork from Picasso, you can immediately point it out. One of the things that Picasso was intrigued with is trying to capture a face pointed straight at the viewer, and also in profile. This is something that Picasso tried to capture in a lot of his artwork. Here's a piece from before Picasso switched to a cubism style. Owls are actually another common element that Picasso uses in different pieces of art. Picasso despised warfare. That's because he witnessed the Spanish Civil War and both world wars. His piece Guernica is arguably his most famous work of art. However, it is not here, but in that piece, it represents his anti-war sentiment very well. These cutout pieces are very fascinating. You don't see very many artists doing things like this. Picasso was also intrigued with bullfighting, since it represented his Spanish culture. This portrait is a painting of his final wife, the wife that he married after his first wife passed away, and he would stay with her for the rest of his own life. In the 70s, he actually had his own television show where he would paint works of art live on screen. Picasso is a very intriguing artist, and there's not very many artists that have the style and the creativity that Picasso brought to the art world. I think this was actually my favorite sculpture by him. We were able to see the garden that he had in his backyard, and it was pretty nice as well. By this time, we were wore out. We had spent so much time doing things within the last 6 days. And here is some video I got from one of our connecting airports. There is New York City in the distance. We are back in the States. But to say that this was the best vacation we ever had would probably be an understatement. This trip was so amazing. There's no way to describe how wonderful and how much fun we had while we were in Paris. Paris is a beautiful city and a stunning, gorgeous destination. We had a blast.